Okay, this week we are going to be talking to a good friend, kind of a mentor to me, a person who I always enjoy interacting with. His name is Tim Weaver. He is one of the professors at the University of Denver, which is where I got my graduate degree and also where I teach right now. He was hugely influential in getting me into that academic world, for which I'm very grateful. But also he's a person that kind of very subtly and without being a dick about it actually pushes me all the time. So his very presence here is kind of a push into something. I mean, we've already been talking just about random stuff, and I got a head full of ideas, so that's always good. But Tim, how you doing?
Great being up here in the treehouse with you in the canyon. So
yeah, this is actually the first interview I'm doing here at the house.
Yeah, and I have to say that having a colleague within walking or biking distance is a unique thing up here, and it's great.
Yeah, well, cool. Thanks a lot for coming up. I appreciate it. So, it sounds to me like you've actually been listening to the podcast, so you know some of the way that this goes. One of the things I like to do is kind of explore people's background, because I'm constantly amazed in the whole media art world by how different everyone's background is and how we all kind of end up in the same place from very different routes. I do know a little bit about your background, and your route to media art is one of the most interesting. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that? One of the kind of landing points that we usually talk about, especially at DU and Emergent Digital Practices, but in the last iteration as Digital Media Studies, is that somehow it ended up being the island of misfit toys, which is fantastic, for a lot of. But in terms of multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity, it's what we're bringing to the convergence is astounding right now because of the ubiquity of the media we're working in, and the influences are important. But yeah, my path is surreptitious, but now I can there's a rationality to it, because I guess, and I'll try to lay that out. But my professional path has come through biological sciences I studied microbiology at Purdue University, and then worked in labs early on back in the in the dark era, the dark ages of in molecular biology, but also in pheromonology, studying chemical communication between different species, and early on. And then I ended up doing a graduate degree in environmental and biochemical engineering at Purdue, and then ended up on the East Coast and on the South Coast, and then finally here in Boulder during the genetic engineering kind of uprising, and ended up doing protein engineering and biochemical engineering with environmental emphasis here in Boulder. And what I was really lucky with is I ran into, there's a lot of different ways to put it politely and not, but an obstruction in my path where I was like, what am I going to do? Like, should I go get a PhD back east, or should I do? So all those were possibilities. And I ended up going to art school at CU Boulder, which was really fortunate for me. And so, of course, everybody including my family, were like, you're throwing away a science career to become a dirtbag artist. And I was like, sounds good to me. And it was a great time for it. It was in the family
80s.
Doesn't understand, because the only interaction they have with artists is the occasional advertisement on TV for the starving artists
Exactly.
at the local Hyatt Regency, right?
And the reversal of fortune was that I had my brother is a professor at Virginia Tech in entomology now, but he had been a filmmaker, and then he was like, I have to make good and become a scientist. And then I was a scientist, and I was like, I have to make good and become an artist. So anyway, in the long run, it actually panned out in that I went to CU Boulder and did my MFA, and then I ended up being actually the first Fulbright from CU Boulder to
be in the MFA program to be awarded a Fulbright. Ended up in South America for a year and a half, which was fantastic. It qualified you to do everything and nothing, which was just like having an MFA does. And so I came, and my MFA was in sculpture. And so when I came back from South America, I was teaching at CU Boulder, and I began to bring in web programming and things like that into the discipline to think about non-material ways of thinking about immersive experience besides sculptural installation. And the content that I was working with was actually the same content that I had been doing my research base, which was about extreme environments and endangerment in the environment, and trying to raise consciousness with what's happening with our surroundings and how we're part of it. So I was doing that in the kind of white paper science mode before, but then I realized there was more than one route to immersing people in the dialogue. And so my sculptural installation work was about that whole notion of coming from the environment and being part of it. And as I moved further into new media, when I finished my MFA, I was teaching at CU Boulder, and then I was working for some software companies and doing environmental work with 3D modeling and 3D programming, and I was doing visualization with them. And so it was this crazy group of astrophysicists that had these ways of modeling black holes, but they wanted it translated into creative work, and I was lucky enough to have to be the one to do it. So I was hanging out in Boulder with this group, Spatial Technology, as one of the visualization people in the mid to late 90s, and it was just a phenomenal time to just kind of launch it all. I ended up teaching at creative programming unit at University of Gävle in Sweden for a while, and having students over there. And so it was a really wonderful time to be able to just open it all up. And now you look back on it and go, how long ago was that? Oh my God! And in the middle of it, somehow there was a gig that opened up at University of Denver in in electronic media arts design, and I ended up taking a position there as an assistant professor, and in digital media studies and emergent digital practices is what came out of digital media studies, and that's where we are now. So the the island of misfit toys is where I ended up, and so what I'm still working with is these ways of translating kind of the bits, the informational bits, to these environmental and what the equivalent of environmental interactions are. So it can be at a molecular level, it can be at a level of working with lost species, of also re-witnessing what's happening out in the environment, going back to these spaces of massive extinctions, and bringing that back to be able to remix it in all this multiplicity of ways of how we work now. So,
boy, there's a lot there to discuss. I want to talk about a couple of things. First of all, the route that you took. So you went, when you decided to sort of like jump from science to art, you took up sculpture, which I think is really interesting. Because a couple of people I know who kind of started diving into the media arts before media arts was an area of study, seem to gravitate towards sculpture. What is it about sculpture that you think might have been a draw for people?
Well, it was a big container then. It wasn't totally. So sculpture, it was interesting in the late 80s and then the early 90s. It was pushing out into actually what new media has inherited, even in social space, for social media. So public art that was really functional in communities there was nowhere to put it, so it ended up in sculpture, right? So it was spatial interaction, really, and spatial narrativity. So I'm still really drawn to spatial narrativity, but with new tools. So having worked in sculptural installation and making objects, and also in these other forms of interaction that were pre-electronic in a lot of ways, and then drawing video into installation and things like that, it became the big container.
Yeah, I just think it's odd though that was the container that ended up drawing it, because if there's anything that's like the opposite of sculpture, it's pictures of stuff on a flat screen.
Yeah. Well, the immateriality that we talk about in digital media, but in reality, it's still drawing from some transcoding or translation of materiality or form. So I think that awareness of form, whether it's whether it's including it's object based, we're still drawing on that to pull to things like 3D printing, obviously, and 3D animation. But for me, my background in sculpture became really informative when I was doing software development in 3D modeling and 3D kernels, because I knew what it should feel like, and I could look at it on screen and have that simultaneity of information. Now that's in terms of the way that we try to inform our students is, everybody in our my colleagues in EDP or Emergent Digital Practices at DU, we all came from studio backgrounds, and so we built the foundation of things from what we knew about the material world. And now there's this, what we're assuming is there might be a gap, and there's also this craving to go back to have this hybridization between analog and digital, not just the digital island, which is actually really great. It's changed a lot of things for us, and I think that's really welcoming versus, you will only live in VR the rest of your life, and it's difficult to compete when you walk out the door and go, oh my God, this is astounding. And so
right. Well, it's funny that you mentioned VR, because now with the Oculus Rift, there's another, there's another bit of excitement over the VR thing. But yeah, I don't know.
I think it's going to be. They're talking about this, going from VR to no interest in VR to rebirth of VR, but now that'll naturally go back to augmented reality again too, because that was the follow up to VR before, and I think that we still have a massive amount of overlay work to do that is really exciting,
So given that you came to digital media through the sculpture route and sort of were a part of the movement towards media art from whence it didn't exist. Early days it was sort of like research-based stuff to see if things could happen. I don't think anybody had really done art. You were kind of there as it was turning into an art form, I would say. At least, I don't know. Do you feel like that's where you were at, or?
Well, I think there's a lot of different channels or streams that, again, we just assume that this is the way they are right now. But even like these aspects of getting exhibitions, when email came up and link systems and all, it was just, before that it was like, I was doing work down in the Amazon and in the Andes, and you would wait 3 months for a letter to come out of the Amazon. Now you just, I'm setting up some work to do in South America, around the UN climate change conference coming up in December. And it's, of course, then there's ignoring emails, and you're like, oh Jesus, I haven't heard from these guys for 3 days. Well, it would have been 3 months in the mid 90s. And you're like, so those aspects of just trying to have the conversation is massive, but and moving forward with it. But I think that, breaking things loose so that people could be as creative as possible to move things forward. Co-streaming with that was just having enough processor power to be able to open it up. And I think there's that kind of crazy comparative thing of this friend of mine years ago, he worked for IBM in Boulder, and he was really excited. He said, oh my God, we finally reached a point where we think we're not limited by the processor to do kind of basic creative things. And I guess I've taught drawing, I've taught sculpture, but I've also taught biomedia and all sorts of other things with that. And I kept thinking we haven't reached the limits of the charcoal stick yet.
Right.
So there's always that I guess I always reflect back on, and trying to get things to, for creative opportunity, and limitations is part of that. I think rewiring things, and we're still doing that. I think.
So to what extent do you think that something's that something might be actually kind of lost by having people study media art as its own thing rather than having to approach it from maybe a more visceral or maybe just a different perspective. Because I mean, you came to art with this huge science background, and as we'll talk about in a minute, that's really informative of how you do your artwork. I mean, if somebody is sort of like comes from, being a kid and playing with games and watching TV to then making videos and maybe making websites, and then they come into art and say, okay, I'm going to study media art. Is there maybe not something lost by them not having a broader worldview?
Well, I think that the rescue point in that is actually hacking. That the way, I think a lot of our students come in and they just assume like, oh, this is the way that you get on the knowledge train for digital arts or new media or whatever. Like, we've got it all lined out. You've got this really incredible foundation for teaching sonic arts now, and so we have it logically laid out, and it's wonderful. The catalog of it is just, people look at it and it's mind-boggling. But it's still in each one of those courses or each one of those means of bringing someone along, that their sense of curiosity and hacking should still be embedded in it. That making tools or hacking things that exist or rewinding the clock and revisiting things earlier, instead of just, again, the issue, I would say probably in the mid to late 90s, is that everybody was assuming it was going to be the digital island and that was going to be it. And I think now we, in terms of media arts, we understand it can be coming from anywhere, which is daunting, and also just there's no limit. The limitations are not what we assume.
Right. Well, it's and it's really interesting, the approach that at least in my experience, the U has taken, which is to constantly be fighting the battle to make sure that you don't become like a tech school for web design.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though I think sometimes students or maybe students' parents would love for them to come out of it with some skill. One of the things I notice is oftentimes students will come in thinking they have an idea for the kind of artist they're going to become.
The preconceived notion is always interesting.
And then the process that you go through to sort of like tear them down and help them rebuild themselves.
Well, I think that the pressure of the approach that we have is it's not a vocational program, right? And the number of tools is astounding. So any one of those approaches, I mean, we can give a foundational orientation on the tools that would be the really likely candidates to use, but coming up with hybrid tools or hybrid processes is when it gets really, really interesting. And of course what we are up against a lot, not always, but in a lot of cases, is that the parents want the value. Like, they're coming in and they're like, what's the practicality of this? And so I guess that's really how we landed with this notion of bringing emergence and complexity into the curriculum. So the whole idea of this whole multi-stream or hybridized influence of it being like, we don't know what's going to be born from something within 10 weeks of a course is, of course, you tell it to a parent and they're like, what am I paying for? What are they paying for here? Like, what are they going to get out of it in the end? And it's like, and the answer is, I don't know. It's like, and then you have to you can't just leave it at I don't know, because then it's like, oh, you're paying this much per credit hour and the student's going to come out in an I don't know mode. The problem is actually the opposite, is that the students there's the opportunities right at this point in time are astounding, and they're getting poached midstream and kind of directed in a way that isn't wide open enough. And so I think that whole notion of emergence and these influences coming in, there might be a new device, like we were talking earlier about the Oculus Rift, like what's that doing in terms of like this notion of VR now, like the rebirth of VR. And so you throw that on the table, like, oh my God, this thing just came out of a Kickstarter project, like we've got the prototype, let's start working with it. within like a week or 2 weeks, you're going to be seeing something you never would have predicted the first week of the quarter.
Right.
And so that notion of the complexity, the multiplicity of influence, could create an emergent pattern that you have no idea about. And that is where, we've included that in the curriculum, because I can't tell parents what their student or their kids going to be doing in 4 years, And
the flip side of it is, I think maybe that story is a little easier to tell now than it would have been 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Because I think now at this point, most parents, and I'm a parent with a kid that's soon going to be going to college.
Yeah.
I don't want my son to learn a thing. I want him to learn how to be a good learner. Because at this point, when I went to college, it was a really big thing to go and be an electrical engineer, because you could get a great job, and if you learn all this analog technology, you could be a great designer and have an excellent job. And all those people that I know from back then are all out of work, because nobody needs that kind of engineer. Most of that engineering is offshore somewhere.
Yeah. If you rattle the parental memory of, I think that that case of. I remember when I went in as a freshman, and there was a geology boom, and everybody was going to be a geologist. And they went in, and so because they're looking at who's coming out 4 years downstream at Purdue, and these kids are getting amazing jobs. By the time those ingoing geology majors finished, there were no jobs.
There were no jobs left.
And it was the same thing for chemie, electrical engineering, all those things. And so if you rattle that, and you talk about, and initiate that in terms of the conversation, the parents, they do understand it. Yeah. Then they understand it. And then you talk about, these lofty ideas about emergence, like what the hell is emergence, And my, response is, well, if you flew here probably to talk to us, when you were flying through the clouds coming into Denver, if you looked out the window, that was emergence. Doesn't mean you're just up in the clouds. It's just weather is an emergent phenomena, and you cannot totally predict it. Thus, we have weathermen that get it right 80% of the time, but there's 20% that's unpredictable. And oh my God, there could be a downpour this afternoon we weren't thinking about. Right. So being open to thinking about emergence and this notion of complexity is something that, in all of our work is actually really welcoming, but it's also really unsettling too. And so I think it's, I was reading this, a lot of times when I'm kind of frozen I have brain freeze, what I do is I just find what's in front of me on the bookshelf, pull it off, randomly open the page and go, this is interesting. Sometimes it's like, oh my God, this is just such crap. But I was down at our place in Santa Fe, and there was an old Alan Watts copy. There was the price on it was $1.75, so that's how old it was, right? And I flipped the book open and I look, and it's he was talking about making sense of the marvelous meaninglessness. Of that's what we're doing here. And I think that a lot of it is that we're launching our own social patterns and patterns of inquiry and creative inquiry for our residents on Earth, and that's an important thing that in itself is really, really important to have the privilege of being able to do. And I think that, no matter how lofty or intellectual or deep technically or all these things, the getting through the marvelous meaninglessness is important.
Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of an awesome place to take people.
Yeah.
And you're very, I don't know, I always think of you as being like one of those elves that helps people find an interesting path. That's the way I experienced you when you were an instructor, and since then just as an artist, and we've our paths have crossed occasionally in that world. I've seen that. Now, one of the things I want to talk a little bit, and this is kind of going back in the conversation, is I want to talk about your art, because much of this discussion so far has been about your work as an educator, but your artwork is really extremely important. And it was the catalyst behind having you be on this podcast as well. my first experience with it was when you actually invited me down to DU, and I had a very interesting thing, which is you had done an art exhibit with some others, and there were some problems. I was helping out with it, but while we were there, they had like the docents coming through. And,
this was the show at the dam at the Denver Art Museum. Yeah,
and the docents were just like, they were there talking about the piece, kind of getting the docents able to talk about it, and they were like, "Oh, here's the artist," right? And so they asked you to come and talk to him a little bit about it, and I kind of sat back and listened to you talk about it, and I was totally entranced because the tale that you wove was one of a locust species that was in the area, and how it was an overwhelming influence on the locale. They had swarming issues because of man's incursion on the area, and all of this stuff, and it really made the artwork for me really come alive. But also it was a really interesting story for me to hear or to see in a very real fashion how you can take things like in biological science, but also informatics, and then visual and sonic arts, and kind of meld them into an installation that was beautiful. And then since then, I've gotten a chance to interact with other work, the book piece that you did, which was really quite stunning. And then the piece that you did where you were doing the things with the
graphite drawings.
Yeah, the graphite drawings, right?
Yeah.
Those are pieces I've seen, and they're really interesting because, again, now, with that first introduction, I really got to see how you were drawing in from so many different wells in order to make your work. Why don't you talk a little bit about, now I just basically like spilled the beans on what you do. Sorry about that. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how you approach that? Because you've got this history in science, and which really provides a nice foundation for this. But you've taken a lot farther than just sort of saying, here's some science, and I'm going to put some fancy pictures and call it good.
Well, I think a lot of the basis of building the means of inquiry that I'm really in love with. There's these aspects of collecting, and then there's also this part of coming to grips with the privilege of being able to read these codes that are important to be translated for the public at large, and then also make them creating a new sensoria so people can be immersed in them, other than where the path of reading these codes is limited. So for example, I had worked for years in protein engineering, so we were developing new proteins for therapeutics for human disease, and I knew how to read the protein codes and knew the significance of the proteins, because proteins, enzymes, and those classes of molecules are incredibly directed. I mean, it's always related to as a key and a keyhole phenomena. It just fits together, and that's why this one little clock in your body works, or not. I mean, that's also why disease persists. So it's something that, somebody goes to the doctor and they don't talk to their doctor on that level, like, well, what about this enzyme failing in my body, and da-da-da-da-da, because it's, routinely for biological scientists, it's a long, crazy path to be able to get to the point of understanding of these really complex phenomena. It might be 25 years, it might be 30 years, and it's tied together with life cycles of beings. So I did that for about 15 years, and I really loved it. But I also realized that there's other ways that this should be opened up to the public, so you can have a broader dialogue. And again, going back to the island of misfit toys. It just, all the pieces were like, oh my God, this is something that's really important to talk about now, because now we talk about not just in the media world, like all these incredible tools that, I mean, I always think that, the laptop computer is the most astounding folk art instrument ever. Because it can be anything, right? And so whether it's folk music or folk art or all these things that you have this level of technology that has to be right or it doesn't work, but you also can just pull things together in this way and link them up that have never been possible, and that's how I really approach it. But getting back to this notion of these exclusive codes that are in are open source. Okay, if we go online and we want to know about, I don't know, like the certain, like the way that the energy system in, say, a condor works. How does it fly? How does it? We can get online, and within literally 3 minutes, we can find the basic components of what, if we can get through the codes, like, oh my God, here's all the pieces and the codes that are the building blocks of the way this animal flies to these incredible heights. But I can read that, but not everybody can read it. There's like less than a 100% of the population of the planet that could possibly reach that. And so I want to be able to open that up and say, okay, here's these building blocks, but I also and build immersive experiences that relate to these new means that we think we evaluate other life forms. Mm-hmm. And so opening up these codes, because I'm privileged to have been able to read those codes before, is I see it as somewhat of a responsibility, but I also want to be able to have a broader dialogue about it. How do we make music with it? How do we make sound art? How do we take these bits that seem meaningless in some way and put them into the sense that we can actually interact with them? Whether it's in a sound envelope or whether it's something, it might be material, it might be something that is a surface we can touch, and then start to talk about these relevant issues of our times that these life forms might be slipping away by touching these ways that the science community evaluates the value of these life forms. So that's part of the collecting that I've done, and because of the privilege that I have through the university, but also as a scientist and an artist, I can find collaborators that have amazing resources to draw on for raw material for making new experiences that way. So I can go to the Museum of Nature and Science and say, I really want to look at all of these lost species and the final residues you have of them. And so I'm very fortunate in that I work a lot with the Museum of Nature and Science in the archives of the museum, in zoology, and I've worked as a fellow there, and now I'm a research associate at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and I can say, okay, here's the last of the passenger pigeons, here's the last of the imperial woodpecker, here's the last, all these things that are at the cascade of a massive extinction that we're in the middle of right now. Pull those out of the cabinets and use them in some way so that others can access them through creative venture. So the process that I've become, there's somewhat of a liberation of these things, that's interesting to me. But then there's also this part of saying, okay, here's the building blocks. How do I then bring people together to be able to have the dialogue, whether it's scientists and or artists or the public, but then also open it up so that I can build tools and do workshops and say, okay, transcoding is something that, we talk a lot about. The tools that we converge on, especially in Max, are astounding for building new sensoria to new experiences in these very complex pieces of data, and enabling people to interact with them, whether they're moving through a space, whether they're listening, whether they're creating. And it opens up the dialogue in this whole other way that normal reading something about the loss of a certain species leaves you kind of hopeless.
Right. Well, I want to talk, that actually leads into something I'm curious about, and you are giving me the opportunity to ask about. And that is really about the politics of what it is you're doing.
Yeah.
And so, we could talk about what people would commonly think of as politics, which would be, you're talking about species extinction, is that real? La, la, la. I don't want to go there as much as I want to talk about, or I'd like to ask you questions about the choices you make, because as you stated, you're one of a relatively few people who can look at these protein codes and come out with some useful interpretation of them, right? That also puts a pretty huge onus on you to not be selective about the codes you choose to portray and the codes that you choose to hide. And I think for people who aren't informed about this stuff, there's always a level of suspicion that says, how do I know that the thing that this person is presenting represents a non, or at least a limited level of politics attached to it?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because there's a point where, people expect scientists to be incredibly objective. They never expect artists to be objective. They're always like, that's subjectivity at its finest and at its worst, right?
Good point.
So hybridizing art and science, of making there's an incredible emphasis on what I would call art science arranged marriages. We'll bring artists and scientists together, we'll sit them at a table, and then voila.
Fantastic stuff will show
up. Oh my God,
right?
look at this. This is so great. But the reality is, it comes down to chemistry, just like any collaboration. And the one thing that, and I go to a lot of gigs, whether they're international conferences or where that dialogue is on the table. And it's interesting because more cases than not, you have scientists that want to be artists and they make lousy art, or you have artists that want to be scientists and they make shitty science,
right.
And so you end up nowhere with it, right? And so you end up with this kind of, effort that's just, and new forms of creativity are, they're being born every day, and that's why I was saying this whole notion of hacking. Scientists look at citizen science as hacking, but citizen science is really, really important in so that opportunity. So this idea of trying to maintain what I do is that in the projects that I have, I think about the preliminary parts of the platform as having a really rigid scientific platform. So that if we draw back to the scientific platform, then we can critique it in a way that is, it's never going to be neutral from the politics.
Right.
There's a big emphasis right now on, it's the 100th anniversary of the extinction of a bunch of different species that are very iconic. The passenger pigeon, the Carolina parakeet, and it's interesting, they're birds. They're very iconic species, but and they were human-induced extinctions. There's a lot of collateral damage of non-iconic species that we wouldn't be talking about, like worms and like weeds and all sorts of things that aren't iconic species, but they've had an incredible impact on our environment and what's declined in it. And a lot of times we'll never even know what's going on behind the scenes. So there's a lot of emphasis in the dialogue on thinking about these iconic species. So it's actually a really great place to have the dialogue and try to keep the foundation neutral and objective. But then I want to be an artist. I still am doing scientific investigation, but that isn't all I do. So saying that I can talk about the platform of what I'm doing to the scientists, then talking about these new experimental sensoria on top of it, that's the way I navigate it. But it still is that I'm not saying I do a lot of field work, which is great because I was a lab scientist when I was doing protein engineering and in environmental engineering and things like that, and in microbiology. But now I split the time between working with these transcodings and the specifics of these molecules, and then going out to where these massive extinction events happened, because I want to witness what's there now. So it might be going to, I just got back from Iceland last spring, where the last of the great auk was hunted into extinction. I was working in Newfoundland before that, where there were millions and millions of this species slaughtered for their feathers, for the feather beds of Europe. Last month I was working down in the Andes, because it's the most profound site for glacial retreat, and the impact on these incredible biodiverse areas of South America is happening. And so I guess there's also this part of trying to understand it on the ground myself.
Yeah.
And then I'm also finally coming to grips that I'm not just this casual observer looking through the glass at it. I'm in the middle of it, from my own vulnerability, from some really crazy things that happened to me. And so I can take my own medical analysis and embed that in it now, right, which is great. So I think that we'll never be, if things are going to be politicized, we'll never be, they're going to be politicized. But I think that there's this part of the immersive experience that 25 years ago, we were talking about this earlier, I did a lot of very intensely frontal political work. It can be dismissed as easily as I just put 50 cents in a newspaper machine, and there's today's headline. Oh, well, that's today. Tomorrow it won't be on there. And so the super politicized work that I was doing 25 or even 30 years ago was beautiful work, but it could be easily dismissed versus if somebody is scratching their head or waking up in the middle of the night from an immersive experience and continuing to think about it, or having a conversation with their child or their kids about it, then that hesitation is where I want to be. And so I think that and there's it's heavy stuff. I was approached by this woman at this show a couple of years ago, and she said, "Well, you're talking about extinctions here? There's no extinctions." And I was like, "Well, there are extinctions every day." And she said, "Well, that's natural. Extinctions are natural." And I said, "Well, human-induced extinctions are, I guess they are natural to a degree, but that's what we're talking about, and it's a different dialogue. But I'm also dealing with it in a way where the audience, by interactive experience in a space, can attach themselves to a sound envelope, and then they're carrying that through the space, and then that is the pointing back to the dialogue. But what I didn't realize, which is really the responsibility of the parent or someone in the family, is I always think about when your mom or dad were they're the person that set your cosmology. They said that's the moon or that's the sun. It's the same thing, like a parent telling a kid humanity killed off this species and it was beautiful. And I think that that was the one thing with this mom. She was like, she didn't want her daughter to know that humans were responsible for wiping out this gorgeous species that we'll never see again. So I think that I don't know how we got there, but but again, that is something that is going to be politicized.
Well, I think it's important though, because the kind of politics that you're bringing to it is an important one to me, because it causes a conversation to occur. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And maybe if you think of the most powerful art, there's a tendency, especially in our media art world, to be the first person to expose a shiny object. Yeah, right?
Yeah, so exactly. Sort of and we love eye candy or ear candy.
Or the grooviest new 3D printer thing, or the grooviest new microprocessor thing that can make whiz-bang displays. But so oftentimes that stuff, much like you were talking about with political art, it ends up becoming tiresome almost overnight because it's immediately eclipsed by the next thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that those tiers of, whether you're on the New Media Festival route, and there's specific new media festivals that want the new interface or the new new device, and how do you use it. And then there's other tiers that are like, we want content, but then they thematically have their festival around content that year. So you look at, like, say, the way Transmedial operates, or SIGGRAPH. I mean, I think they're two different, and they have gone through different kind of iterations and passages in terms of the way they've looked at, in the late 90s, SIGGRAPH was like, oh my God, you're actually using the internet to make art? Like, it's amazing. Just the fact that you use the web and you had content on there, that's great. But now, and then
they've kind of swung back to the thing about, like, oh, look at the speed that we can get out of our GPU.
Exactly. Yeah. So
let's talk a little bit about the process behind your work. So as you said, you go out and you do field work, which in your case represents what?
Well, there's two levels of the project that I've been working on for about actually the last 6 years is a project called the series is called Hylaea, and Hylaea conceptually refers to the lost. The usage of that originally were the lost forests of Greece that were cut into nothing for the Bronze Age to fire the melting of the bronze, and it became something that was lost. These lost forests, and then the next kind of surfacing in cultural history about the use of the word Hylaea, or the use of the term Hylaea, came from Humboldt when he landed in the neotropical forests of South America, and here's these amazing biodiverse environments, and in his mind, he had found Hylaea, these lost forests that were, here it is. Mm-hmm. And so that's when in neotropical ecology, Hylaea is constantly referred to in those elements. And then, but then also what's interesting is the futurists in Italy in the 1930s referred to Hylaea as their panacea and their utopian community as well that was being reformed. So the metadata of Hylaea is what I'm really working with, is bringing these pieces back to, I can't say they're remixed, they're kind of resynthesized, and from these different bits. And so my process, one of the pieces of metadata which is important is, okay, I'm talking about what occurred or is still occurring in these environments. It might be the redwoods in California, it might be coastal environments in South America or in Iceland, but I want to be able to just go there and take this bit from it to say, here it is at this point in time. I was listening to a lecture of Brian Greene's yesterday, and of course there's this notion of past, present, and future. They're all happening at the same time, but I can't get back there. Mm-hmm. So I just, I do a lot of field recording, and that becomes the foundation of interactive installation, or what I'm calling afterlife cinema projects. They're relating to the afterlife of these environments, or the presence of it. The other bits that I mine are from open source data sources of kind of new biology data, or new bioinformatics or ecoinformatics, which are, they might be DNA information, they might be protein information from certain species, they might be other environmental conditions, and those are things that are constantly being thrown into libraries, and they're accessible online, but again, they're coded. And what I do with those bits are create a transcoding base from them that might create a visual transcoding, where it might be, say, a sequence of images from these environments, and then I can overlay that onto a protein code of, say, that, from a species, that environment, and it can interpret the visual information from that space. So I've been working on a project in the redwoods in California, which is, here's this last little spit of these magnificent, gigantic trees, and it was a dominant species on Earth for 26 million years, and now it's in the Santa Cruz Mountains, right. And it's, so you go there, and it's one of those environments where you're like, I don't even know what to say. I mean, it's amazing. Yeah. And then we were also talking about the acoustics of that space when we were talking about sampling for convolution reverb, to be able to say, okay, can I move this digital space by capturing some sample from it, and creating the digital acoustics of the forest, and be able to bring that back to an environment or an interactive environment or a performance. So all those bits, again, I mentioned about the collecting, and they're the metadata that I'm collecting to be able to compose from. And it might end up in a sound composition. I worked for a couple years around this notion of human cryptochromic proteins or cryptochromic proteins, as cryptochromic proteins are really an interesting protein that exists in all species, and they are what roots time and for species. So they're integral in circadian rhythms, they're integral in biological clocks, and then they're light sensitive.
How time works.
How time works specifically for that species and its sense of biological time, and how that species deals with light. So it might be that we navigate by light, we for migration, we grow by light. If you're a tree, and so all species have these cryptochromic proteins. So I looked at that as this kind of really interesting audio compositional base, that it's what is responsible for humans exploring and taking over new land and things like that. So it became a persistent theme in a lot of different sound environments that I was building for a few years. And so I would compose around treating the cryptochromic protein sequence as an instrument or as another layer of sound for a polyphonic base of a space. And somebody could walk into a space and then activate this, or I could play it doing a live cinema piece. And so, and again, this whole notion of transcoding of proteins at Peter Gina at the Chicago Art Institute, he started doing that work years ago, but it was stuck on the notion of like, it's I can do this translation and it's interesting by itself, and I'm interested in what about the entire genome, what about putting it into a content base of saying I've got all the proteins for the way that a certain insect or a bird flies from its bioenergetic system, and then I can compose a piece from it by transcoding to a sound base. So essentially, you're tuning the protein to a degree by saying, okay, here these residues, they follow all over 3 octaves of notes based on the solubility of one of these molecules and the physical characteristics of the whole series, and then you can tune the protein that way and use it as an instrument.
So how it sounds to me like,
I know that's trippy, but
it is
black magic,
right? Well, but I'm curious, like just from a compositional standpoint, then when you take some arbitrary set of data, like from one of these proteins or whatever, and you try sonifying it, how often do you do it and just say, it is technically correct, right, but it's not interesting.
Yeah. Well, again, the basis of it is, what I'm trying to hold to is I have a way to tune the protein or retune the protein. And or the DNA sequence or whatever I'm working with in terms of these molecular sequences that are being transcoded to audio sequences. And so you have these other variables then to work with that are just incredible. The timestamp, the pitch shift, it's amazing. And then also putting it into other contexts to be able to interact with it is, in a lot of ways, it's luck that you run into something that's interesting. But again, that's when you get to become an artist.
Right.
And so that's what's important of making that, that shift and saying, okay, now we're from objective land to super subjective land. I have to move ahead with this and work intuitively with it versus analytically. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting to me is that I mean, this goes back to the whole art, science, chemistry thing that I was doing a lecture down at the Santa Fe Institute a couple of years ago about transcoding, and that's a hard crowd to play to. I mean, that's trial by fire, and there's some amazing minds there. It's just an astounding place. And there was one of the scientists that was a visiting scientist was really interested, but really critical in about this whole notion of transcoding of proteins. And it turned out he was head of the Ecoinformatics Institute at University of Zurich. And I was like, Jesus, okay, we'll work with this. And so he was real critical when I was lecturing, and then afterwards he was like, this is astounding, I want to assign this postdoc to you because this is so important, because we are just frozen in data land, and we have no new sensoria to work with, and you're stepping forward with these tools. And it turned out that he was a musician. And so the chemistry just happened to be there, whereas people that were protein chemists were just like, that's the biggest bunch of bullshit I've ever heard. I mean, you never know where it's landing. Actually, people at the Santa Fe Institute would never say that. They would conceivably, they're very...
They would think it. But
they would probably think it. But they would be really open-minded, and there's some phenomenal people down there right now that are opening up that argument. But you're really... It's important to be an artist when you have to be an artist and not say, like, I'm a scientist too, and watching yourself just get gunned to death in front of everybody.
Good. I mean, like you said, get beat up as an artist who's doing poor science.
Yeah, exactly. So the astounding thing is the amount of variables to work with, and with the tools we have, or building your own tools like in Max are just... That's why we always had that argument. I'm like, I look at Max as this incredible toolkit for artists, but it's an astounding toolkit for scientists.
Right.
That's just like wide open. And I think that, because, this whole notion of building these new possibilities is right there. So.
To what extent do you think we need? Boy, this has gone long, and there's like 10,000 other things I'd like to ask you about. Okay. But it strikes me when I look at what's being put out there as sort of like visualization of big data and all this stuff, which is sort of getting to be a meme at the moment.
Yeah.
It also seems to me like people are really focused on really beautiful first order implementations of the data. Yeah. That there's almost more of an interest in doing a really cool looking surface than there is in getting deeper into the data. How does that get turned around?
Well, I think it the stage of the encounter, the movement is early. In terms of like exercising.
In its infancy.
Yeah, it's in its infancy. So if you even think about it like, in terms of cinematic arts and playing out, other themes that, I always say like, we haven't done, live cinema-based documentaries or animated films or, even those kind of like genres. But, I keep going back to, there's a project that I really wanted, that I'm, it's always on the shelf, but I have to get to it, is this project called Protein Noir, which is going back to the idea of film noir, but it being expressed through these proteins that are about, that get expressed during fear or, these encounters that are classic film noir themes. So it might be about adrenal proteins, it might be about hemoglobin, it might be about these things, and you remix film noir themes, classic ones based on the soundtrack being recomposed from Protein Noir soundtracks.
Right.
So I think that we're so early in it that we haven't gone to the dark themes per se, or these other aspects of experimental parts of the media that are still pretty wide open.
Well, that's interesting you say, because every time a new book on visualization comes out, I'll scamper off and get it and look at it and just be kind of disappointed. Yeah. That the state of the art seems to be not very state of the art.
Yeah, there's two books I just got that I'm looking at. I'm teaching a biomedia class that is going to be a true art science class this coming spring with, half biology majors and half EDP majors that I'm hoping. I mean, actually the biology department's hounding me on it, which is awesome. But the books that I'm looking at for it it's interesting, like what's, the people are writing on, and one of them is on molecular aesthetics, which was like, I was like, and some of it I'm not very into, but some of it's like really amazing to think about this other tier of media being molecularly oriented. Right. And the other one is on phantasmal medium. And we've talked about that in terms of afterlife. Like we're looking at these bits of residues of lost species, whether they're protein sequences or phylogenomic sequences, and saying, oh, this family split 26 million years ago. Well, that's a narrative backbone for media to ride on.
Right.
To
well,
tell these stories.
And especially as we're finding that some of those resonances exist beyond the sort of beyond the grave in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. And we, and there's this whole. The Long Now Foundation is investigating de-extinction, and it's very much like, okay, we're going to bring back the passenger pigeon. Damn it, like it's going to happen. And so that's a really active dialogue. Like, no habitat, like how's that work? And so I've been working this year. I just did a project with the Museum of Nature and Science, and it was great. It was really exciting because they let me do the performance in the Rare Bird Hall. So I got to do 2 big video screens that we're used to for the live cinema work. But then I got to light the dioramas of all these lost species as these other nodes for the performance space. Where the dusty diorama then becomes this incredible color lit piece in the performance, and so we were talking about earlier of I've been working a lot with these morphology drawings, which are the form of, say, a wing or a certain specific part of a species. And I'm drawing over those with graphite, and then sending wirelessly back and forth to my DAW or my audio unit or from Max, and I built this little, what I'm calling a probe-Duino, which can probe parts of the drawing, the graphite circuitry, and treat the drawing over the what was a direct scan and printed image on paper of the passenger pigeon as an instrument. So there's all sorts of different ways to interact with this data and these notions of what life forms are that are astoundingly wide open, either coming from the informatics or new biology realm, or the tools that we can hack or build in our domain, which is, it's an astounding time,
Well, Tim, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk. Boy, there's so many more things I'd love to cover, and maybe we'll have you come back again sometime.
Yeah, well, thank you. I could talk to you all day, so we should just go on a 12-hour flight somewhere.
Yeah, really, and then be sick of each other. But
Jesus, I'm off the plane. Oh my God! So, but I always say that, like, oh my God, like that person, like, can't you sit next to them on a ride to Delhi or something? So yeah, I always love talking with you. It's always mind opening for me. So thanks a lot for the opportunity to
likewise, have thank you so much, and. Yeah, we'll plan on getting together again soon. But
okay,
in the meantime,
great.
Have a great day, man.
Okay, thanks.
So there you have it. Thanks to Tim for spending some time talking smart with me. It's always a hoot to talk to him, but I always find out new stuff about Tim as well. And again, I'm always seem to be pushed by the examples that he sets. If you're interested in finding out more about Tim and his work, you can check out his overview at www.primamateria.org, or to get a dossier, Tweaver, that's TWEAVER .biotica, BIOTICA.org. I'll have links up on the podcast website if you need to check it out. Otherwise, thanks again for listening for another week. Thanks to all the people out there that make it possible to do this podcast, particularly my employer, Cycling 74, who is incredibly embracing of my work doing this, and in this case, for the folks at DU, in particular Tim, himself for not only doing the interview, but for helping me become the artist I've become. So thanks for listening, and I hope to talk to you again. I don't hope. I'll just talk to you next week. Bye.